Hello and welcome to this podcast, which is part of a series called Inventing Embodiment. My name is Jonathan Burrows. I'm a choreographer and also a faculty member at the Centre for Dance Research at Coventry University. Last year, my colleagues at CDE met online once a week to talk, and the conversation kept coming back to the question of how we speak about embodiment. This podcast aims to capture some of the research I was fortunate to hear then. My guest this morning is Vicki Thoms, who is a dance scholar and philosopher at CDE. Welcome, Vicki.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Jonathan.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about what you're researching at the moment?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I'm looking at British theatre dance from between 1918 and 1949 to try to use it as a lens to understand British national identity. My thinking is that British theatre dance really had a flowering of interest around these years, so that it came from kind of a niche foreign entertainment, in the music hall specifically, and through these years, through that sort of stretch of 40 years, became an important form of national culture that reinforced positive ideas about a national identity. And so I'm really quite curious to ask questions about what happened around national identity through the lens of theatre dance.
And what are the ways that you do this research? What resources are you drawing upon and how are you questioning them?
So, yeah, Jonathan, I think that's really quite interesting. What I'm doing is kind of not the traditional way of getting evidence or collecting data. What I'm doing is I'm going to a cross-section of people that might have been in the audience to understand the kinds of testimony or interpretations they might have from viewing dance during this time. And it's quite interesting the kinds of people that are going to theatre and recording their thoughts. So rather than going to the traditional theatre archive, which will still be important for my research, I'm also supplementing that quite considerably with testimony, in personal diaries, personal journals, in archives in the UK and in the US, looking at where theatre dance comes into play as a really important touchstone for negotiating the quite challenging changes to what and how Britain was perceived both nationally and internationally during this time.
And there is a certain amount of film of the ballet at that time. Are you watching the film and are you finding, what correlations are you finding between what you see and what people say?
Yeah. I'm not really spending, looking at any kinds of evidence or documentation that gives us a sense of what those works look like will be really important. But I'm not really foregrounding film so much. What I'm really trying to do is, because photographs will come into play, and also photographs in things like the profusion of popular journals such as the Tatler and the London Illustrated News, which began to sort of flourish at that time as well. So what kinds of ideas about British theatre dance were being negotiated in those publications? So I'm very interested in film because film will give that readily available document of the dance in a way that words won't. But that becomes kind of an interesting add-on to the research itself.
So questions around British identity are very pertinent at the moment. And I'm assuming that the way that you're approaching it is towards questioning the negatives as well as the positives of what was being embodied there within dance culture and ballet specifically. Is that right? Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. What I'm really looking at through it's dictated in part by looking through the lens of British theatre dance. And British theatre dance at this time, and I'm holding firm to that term, knowing very well that ballet served a huge audience of participants. But I'm also holding to that term because it gives a wide understanding of the form. And through that lens, we see an awful lot of things happening around how female identity changes. So I'm looking at female identity and trying to see how that is also negotiating things like class, race, and particularly through the lens of femininity, gender. So it's an interesting period because the literal falling apart of empire, so to speak, it happens, not until the late 1940s. But through this period, you have a whole bunch of challenges that are sort of presaging this event. And even through the late 19th century, there's a real sort of anxiety about what is this empire? How does it relate to what we know as Britishness?
So in this series of podcasts, we're looking at very, very different and simultaneous ideas of what embodiment might mean and how it impacts upon people both within contemporary dance practice, within other dance practice, and within wider society. Is that a word that you would use in this research that you're doing?
Absolutely. I find it pertinent that we see a flowering of British dance theatre as an eventual form of national culture that is sold to the world at the end of the 1940s through the Hurock tours, being simultaneously growing and ascending in importance during a time of, national anxiety about identity because it is an embodied form. And I see that in particular as a point of, research that's not been really considered. Why is it that this embodied form in particular is so important during this era? And, in terms of questions of what does this embodiment do for questions of national belonging and identity? What does it do for large groups of a cross-section of population in this country to go and view dance, ballet, contemporary dance in things like the Second World War? What does that serve as a form of palliation and help for a very challenging time?
And can you give an example of a kind of embodiment that would be represented there and that you feel that people were drawing upon?
You ask a very good question there. There's definitely, I haven't quite put my finger on it, and that's part of the research project, is to really try to understand what's happening here. My sense is, and my hypothesis or my intuition is, that this is a kind of embodiment that is very form. I think the embodied experience of a theatre, being in a theatre with others, sitting in close contact, viewing a spectacle or a performance, or even, if you want, a testimony that is produced by live bodies on stage. There's something about that is central to the question of the importance of embodiment as a means of understanding oneself and one's place in the world. But I think what is interesting for the things I want to look at as well is how does that make it into text, into written word? How does that translate? And I think it is just as important an aspect of embodiment itself to consider how the translation is made through to diary entries, through to images that we see in the monthly and weekly popular journals of the time, and also into the newspapers. So it's a very complex understanding of embodiment that I'm trying to put my finger on. I'm not sure that I'm quite there yet, but that's part of the excitement about the research.
And last question, do you have any questions or problems that you bump up against to do with the way that the idea of embodiment is used in contemporary dance practice and in contemporary dance scholarship?
Well, first of all, I think there is a wealth of research to be done in contemporary dance, in dance studies, on refining the importance that dance holds in relation to embodiment. I think that that is an untapped area that is just begging for excavation and clarification and kind of categorization. But on top of that, I think that there is a lack of clarity or a missing link between other forms of practice or other forms of, thinking about doing, being, that takes account of the really quite significant role that embodiment plays for identity.
Thanks, Vicki. That feels like a good place to pause. Thank you for sharing your thinking with us.